I want to talk a little bit about what is fellowship, because there is the idea that people are either in fellowship with us or out of fellowship. It's sort of binary black and white. You're in or you're out. And I want to talk about that a little bit because this just doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It's a far too simplistic approach to this idea of fellowship. Now, we're living in a digital world, and people are no longer, as they used to be, limited to going to one particular building of four walls where they hear Bible teaching. They can get that Bible teaching from the internet or YouTube or whatever it might be. And they can experience some sort of fellowship with people online. They don't have to come to a physical building. And this is the trouble in insisting that if you want to be in fellowship with God and the Lord Jesus, you've got to come to our particular church and do things in our particular way. And if we kick you out for whatever reason, then, well, you're out and you're cut off from those things. That's not how it is. These days, what defines a believer is what sort of apps you have on your phone, how often you use them, what you listen to as audio, as podcasts, what you watch as video, what films or movies, if any, you look at, how much time you spend actually engaging with the text of the scriptures, what sort of Facebook groups or social media groups or WhatsApp groups you're involved in. That, in reality, is now what is defining somebody's Christianity, not what four walls you go and plonk yourself down in for, I don't know, 2, possibly 3 times a week if you're close enough to a group to be able to attend. No, that is all passé. And it's a good thing, because really relationship with God is not about what you do for 3 hours per week. It's about your whole life. It's about what you listen to as you go to sleep, what you listen to when you wake up in the morning, etc. So there's a few myths with this idea that we are either in or out of fellowship. I want to suggest that fellowship is an experience and not an agreement on paper. I grew up in a very large church, and there were plenty of people there whose faces I knew, but I had no common experience with them, and I didn't even know them really as persons, as fellow believers. So my fellowship with them in practice was very limited. There were others with whom I shared all sorts of experiences, and our fellowship was the closer. Now, the Bible does not give a statement of faith. It doesn't ever define in theological terms what you must believe and what you mustn't. There is no statement of faith written in the Bible. Any attempt to write a statement of faith is doomed, really, because it is the interpretation by the people who are writing it, and they become the power brokers. And why are they the power brokers? Why is somebody else the power broker? So that's a foolhardy thing. Fellowship is experience, and probably aware that in the New Testament this word koinonia is used a lot, and it means what is common. Koine Greek is common Greek. What you have in common. Now, there are times in the Bible where the word is used just literally in that sense, to explain that we may have something in common with someone else. For example, the disciples were partners in their fishing business. They were koinos, if you like. They had in common the fact that they were running a fishing business. You may have fellowship in that sense with a business partner. The guy may be an atheist, but you are, to some degree, you have something in common. The guys you work with in the office or whatever, you are koinos with them. Now, of course, Christian fellowship is about what we have in common by way of experience with others, but there are, in spiritual terms, but there are shades, there are degrees of fellowship. I mean, technically, you may feel yourself to be in fellowship, with a brother the other side of the planet who believes the same thing as you do and apparently shares the same doctrinal conclusions that you have on certain matters, but actually, in reality, your fellowship with that person is very, very limited. Whereas you might, for example, have a friend that you've gone through missionary experiences with, and you got arrested and you got beaten up and you had this happen to you and that happened to you, and you had the joy of seeing people converted, the shared sorrow of seeing people falling away or dying or even being murdered for their faith, people whom you had baptized. And so, therefore, your experience of fellowship with that fellow missionary, for example, your friend or whatever, will be that much deeper. And that is how it is. Fellowship is, in that sense, experience, rather than being tied together by some statement of faith or common set of theology. And that doesn't work anyway, because there's plenty of people who believe the same theology but are at each other's throats over other matters or practical matters or whatever. And it doesn't bind them together in reality. One usage of the term is when Paul talks in Philippians about how the Philippians had fellowship with Paul in the work of the gospel. As I say, two missionary guys going out there or girls going out there preaching the gospel in difficult circumstance will have fellowship with each other. And then to the Corinthians, he talks about it, that by you supporting the work that we're doing, by sending funds and support, etc., he says that is fellowshipping with us. So it is a bond between comrades. It is a shared experience. But experience and the intensity of experience, the nature of experience, is on a sliding scale. So to say that someone's not in fellowship or out of fellowship, well, this is not what it's like. I know people who, believers, who are in very tight little fellowships, as they're called, who are not allowed to break bread with anybody outside their group, and them and myself do not break bread together. But we share a huge amount in common. We are in fellowship, in reality. So the setting of boundaries on fellowship by saying you are now out or you are now in, etc. This isn't actually appropriate to the whole idea of what fellowship actually is. You take Hebrews 2, verse 14. We're told there that there is a certain fellowship experienced by all of us by reason of the fact that we are flesh and blood. We are all flesh and blood. And so the Lord Jesus partook or shared in common that same nature with all of humanity. So in some sense, if you like, he was in fellowship with all of humanity. And yet he has a deeper fellowship with us. You see, the children, since then the children are sharers in flesh and blood. We all have flesh and blood in common. We're in fellowship with each other on that point. He also himself in like manner partook. He shared in that same nature. Okay, so then we are in fellowship, if you like, with all flesh and blood, with everyone who's human. And the Lord Jesus likewise partook, had fellowship with all those who are of our nature by having our nature. But as I say, there are degrees of fellowship, and there are degrees to which that is experienced between us. Now, you come to Acts chapter 2, and we're told that the early believers continued in the apostles' doctrine, in fellowship, and the breaking of bread and prayers. And that has been twisted a bit to say that, you can only have fellowship on the basis of the apostles' doctrine. Well, that will contradict just all the other references and usages of the word koinonia. It's different. It's used in all sorts of contexts. But what I think that passage in Acts 2 is saying is that, the apostles stood up and preached, and they taught. And their teaching, their didache, I would say, is not so much theological points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, But it's simply saying that they taught. They were teaching. And yes, those who listened to them approvingly had fellowship with each other on that basis. And yes, they fellowshiped together in prayers together. They prayed together. That doesn't mean you can only pray with someone who is, quote, in fellowship, because you have examples of Peter, for example, and John going into the temple to pray. Well, yeah, they were praying standing next to the Jews who had just crucified the Lord Jesus and who had all sorts of totally wrong doctrinal ideas about the nature of Messiah, the death state, the nature of God's kingdom, the devil, all sorts of things they had wrong. But Peter and John still went to the temple and prayed next to them. And so when we read that, yeah, they continued in the apostles' fellowship by listening to their teaching, their doctrine, as the King James would have it, and by praying together and having all things in common, yeah, but that is not an exclusive boundary. It can't be, because, as I say, Peter and John themselves went and prayed in the temple. They had experience with others who also loved hearing the apostles' teaching or doctrine or didache. They might have, between themselves, interpreted it differently. If Peter gave a 2-hour sermon or teaching, well, they were all bound together. The crowd who listened were bound together, maybe by their general approval of it, but they might actually have interpreted various points of it differently. That is normal. That is absolutely what happens if you sit down in let's say, a village in an unbelieving non-Christian country, and the folks come and sit and listen to you, and you teach them for an hour or so, and maybe 20 of them will say, yes, I agree with that. But if you probe deeper, you'll find that they actually had slightly different understandings to each other of what you had actually been saying. So, what I'm saying then is that fellowship is an experience. It is experience, and it is never defined on the basis of any kind of statement of faith, of any kind of systematic theology, because that is never written down anywhere in the Bible, certainly not in the New Testament. It is experience. And it has been my little experience in my small life that, as Paul Tournier said many years ago, that experience unites. And it is doctrine and the sense of theology that tends to divide. If all that is holding us together is an on-paper statement, well, what happens if I understand that this way? Oh, but you understand it that way. Oh, well, we're going to have an argument. We're going to fall out of fellowship. And that happens. That is true to observed experience. Happens all the time and has happened for generations. Whereas experience unites. You may be with somebody who maybe thinks somewhat differently about this Bible verse or that theological point, and yet they are committed to the Lord Jesus. Now, and you experience fellowship with each other. Now, Christian fellowship is in the Lord Jesus Christ. That is what is common. You love him and I love him. I ask every day for him to fill me with his mind, with his thinking, and you do as well. We have a common point of contact. It's rather like maybe you meet some distant relative who you've never met, and the only thing you talk about if you go out for coffee is Uncle Albert or Great Uncle Albert. It's the only commonality you have. That I remember Great Uncle Albert, and so does this long-lost relative of mine. And so that's all we think about. That's all we can talk about, because that's all we have in common. And so it is fellowship in the Lord Jesus. Your vertical, as it were, connection with him, and my vertical connection with him, we may be other sides of the mountain, but it is that which binds us together. It is that which brings us together. And of course, Paul talks about we are called unto the fellowship of the Lord Jesus. And he says in Philippians 2 that he looks forward, Philippians 3, that he looks forward to fellowshipping him, the Lord Jesus, at the resurrection. So our connection with God and with the Lord Jesus is not total, is not totally fluent, if you like, as we would like it to be, but we are called towards that fellowship of his Son, 1 Corinthians 1. And so, in the same way as our fellowship with him is not perfect, how little a portion is heard of God in any case, so our connections with each other are going to be imperfect. You do not have a case of, oh, we are in fellowship, oh, we are not in fellowship. It's a totally simplistic, inappropriately simplistic way of looking at it. There's also the fact, as John says, that if we walk in the light, as he is in the light, we have fellowship, we have communion with one another. And yet we all fail to walk in that light perfectly as we should. And there may be some who visibly to us don't. You may know someone, a brother, sister, who is an alcoholic, and that affects a lot of things in their life. But, well, they still believe. I'm not going to say they don't walk in the light, but I'm afraid the fact that in some ways they walk in darkness in some aspects of their life, just as you do, just as I do, that does affect the breadth and nature of our fellowship with each other, with one another, as John puts it. Now, Paul talks about the fellowship of the Spirit, and as soon as you talk about the Spirit, people get a bit nervous because it all seems a bit sort of touchy-feely and all that sort of thing. The fellowship of the Spirit means that his Spirit is working in me, and it is working in you, and because of that, we thereby are bound together. I could tell you things that happened to me that I thought nobody would believe, that I thought was too weird. Well, it was only me. But you probably had a similar experience, or someone else had a similar experience, and they tell me their story. I'm like, wow, I am not alone. And they're the same with me. Oh, Duncan, thanks. I'm not alone then. No, you're not alone. Wow, I thought I was the only one. You see, that is the fellowship of the Spirit. That is what I may experience with you if we go out for coffee together and talk not about, the state of the nation and all that stuff, but, about the Lord Jesus and about the work of the Spirit in our lives. Yes. And that is fellowship as experience. Somebody else may apparently believe all the things that I do and that you do, but I haven't been out for coffee with them. I've not much to do with them. I haven't got that breadth of experience with them. And so I'm not saying we're not in fellowship, but in terms of fellowship as experience, well, no. And you see, this is why people are leaving denominational Christianity in droves, including our own community. Because they see that this is not so, that it's only us. We're the only ones. No. They see that, as I began by saying, the fellowship with the Lord Jesus and therefore with each other is far wider than that, particularly in our digital age in which we live.